Hello and welcome back. It's so great to have with me a very special guest, Lori Abrams. Lori and I crossed paths last year and have become soul brother sisters very quickly because she is involved in an area that is near and dear to my heart. She's involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and she is the CEO of Health Equity. She's also on the board of advisors of New Enterprise Ventures, Tiger Lily, and WIT, which stands for We're in It Together. And Lori and I are going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion is obviously a very broad subject, but we're going to talk specifically today in DE&I and how it applies to clinical trials. And clinical trials is an area that we at Pharmacentra work in very heavily. We do a lot of recruiting, a lot of talking to patients and helping hold patients' hands. And so this is a topic that I found quite interesting because it's an area that isn't necessarily readily apparent to most people that come from outside the industry or even inside the industry, that this is a real issue. And the more I dug into it, the more I learned, the more I realized that DE&I and the way it applies to specifically clinical trials, phase 1, 2, or 3, DE&I is a very important issue that we need to be paying attention. Lori, welcome, first of all, and help us understand why this is such an important subject for us to discuss. Specifically, it applies to clinical trials.
Well, it's an important subject because for a very, very long time, clinical trials, at least will focus on the United States, clinical trial participants were Caucasian men. And as we look at today in 2023, we see whole ethnicities and races of people who have very small participation rates. So for example, if we look at African American or Blacks, approximately 9% of clinical trial participants fall into that category. And in the Asian community, about 11%. And so that leaves Hispanics and Caucasians to round out the rest of the clinical trial participants. And when you don't have clinical trial data on everybody, then you really don't know if the drugs are efficacious, meaning effective, or safe.
So, that brings up a very good question. Demographically, this country is changing.
Right.
In the next 20 years, we'll be a majority country, most likely. I think that's the time frame I read about.
Right.
So if we're not including minorities in clinical trials, that means when I go to the doctor, to bring it down to real terms, I go to the doctor writes me a prescription, I happen to be African American, and I take that drug, I might have an adverse reaction or it might not work. Is that the implications that I'm hearing?
Those are the implications. And there have been drugs that have been put on the market that down the road were found to either not be effective in certain populations or even unsafe. And so, I guess I would ask you, Dan, the question, would you want to take a medication that was tested on other people, everyone except for Caucasian men? Would you feel comfortable doing that?
Right. Yeah. When you put it that way, right. Yeah. So now we've established the consequences, the real life and death consequences of not having diversity within a trial, phase 1, 2, or 3.
Mm-hmm.
How do we approach this subject? And that's a big issue. How do you eat this elephant? One bite at a time. What does that mean to include people? What are the barriers to success? What are the barriers to recruiting? What are the barriers to keeping people in a trial? And how do you get that number up? So help us understand what are some of the tools that you've seen used successfully.
So there are different types of barriers. There are barriers within the community, which include things like trust, accessibility, understanding clinical trials, even getting diagnosed, which we can go into in a minute. So that's the first grouping. The second grouping of barriers, I would say, would be the clinical trial sites themselves. People are at a site, they're given a set time that they're expected to get patients into the trial. And you tend to recruit those patients that that are in your location, and speed is often of the essence. And then the third barrier are the sponsors, those that are conducting the clinical trials. And so sponsors tend to go to the same sites. Often they may go to different geographies where they know that there are a higher number of diverse patients in those locations. But if you're going to the same investigators over and over, you can expect the same outcome.
Right.
So, so those are the three areas of concern. Now, how do you break down the barrier with the sponsors? The sponsors are actually starting to do a couple of things. One, some of the larger companies are starting to train people right out of medical school to become clinical trialists from some of the diverse medical institutions, and looking for diverse physicians who are interested in becoming clinical trialists. And that's a good thing, because some people would like to see someone who looks like them as their physician. So that's number one. Another thing that some sponsors are trying to do, and this is going to be a little more challenging, is to set up new sites in underserved areas. And that's a challenge because it's not easy to set up a new site, and it's expensive at a community health center or an individual physician's office to set up a new site. So they need training, they may need equipment, they'll need financial sponsorship. In the long run, it's a great idea, and I think that that's going to need to happen. The third thing the sponsors are doing, and this is not by choice, but we have something going into the law, which is called the Diverse Strategy Action Plan. And this is a requirement by the FDA. When you're going to have a regulatory, a drug that gets approved by a regulatory agency, you need to develop a plan that you submit to the FDA. And it's a complex and fully thought out plan of how you're going to work within the community, how you're going to work to increase your diverse patient populations and include them in your trials, how you're going to work with the voice of the patient, how you're going to work with advocacy, what you know about the epidemiology of your disease and who gets it, where the prevalence is. And so I think that having that diverse action plan is a great start. What I'd like pharmaceutical companies to start thinking about is, that's great. So you have a strategy at a sponsor level. But if you don't have a strategy at the site level, then how do you actually execute and get the patients that you really need to be successful? And so what I've been recommending to sponsors is to mandate at your sites that they create a site level diversity action plan. And that action plan can be monitored by either the CRAs when they come on visits or the site monitors. And if something's not working, they can change it up. And that will at least help them to be focused a little bit more on including a broader degree of people. I also recommend to sponsors that they bring in diverse patients at their investigator meetings, so they get to learn firsthand what worked or what didn't work.
What are the specific barriers to a specific population?
Exactly. Right? And also to have each principal investigator and study coordinator take implicit bias and microaggression training.
Wow. So, I mean, the fact that the FDA is mandating this now tells us that there's a problem.
Right. So several years ago, the FDA established the snapshots, which would tell anybody who looked at the snapshot page, this drug just got approved, and here's what the breakdown is in demographics. And I don't know whether they did that so that people would get that information or they'd be embarrassed. But it didn't work so well. this, I'm very, very pleased. It worked very well for me at the two companies that I came from. It also was intuitive. If you're going to have a recruitment plan, then you should have a diversity plan. And so it's not a checklist. And if you hand a checklist to the FDA, they're going to hand it back to you. But the other good thing about this diverse action plan is you really, as a CEO of a company or the head of an R&D program, can say, this is our culture now. This is required by me as the leader of this organization or the leader of this department. And I expect you, you, the division, or you, the company, to make this part of your DNA.
Yeah.
This is what we're going to do.
Oh, it's I guess it's appropriate that this is happening at the beginning of the cycle of drug development. And
right.
what we're hearing is that this should trickle down to the commercialization as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So phase one is in healthy volunteers. So at the end of phase one and the beginning of phase two is really when you develop this plan. And so it's very, very early. And that's also when you start, I believe, that you bring patients and caregivers in to start helping you design your synopsis, your study, and how to operationalize it. Everything should be co-created with patients, diverse patients. So at that point that you start developing that plan, you have your PK and PD data. You understand the prevalence of the disease and where it is. And so everything kind of falls into place at the beginning of phase two. And that's when you should start bringing your diverse patients in that plan and in every step of the way. And if you do that, then those patients who are diverse, or participants who are diverse, go back to their communities. And what do you think they do? They tell their friends, their neighbors, their relatives that the sponsor is including them as a diverse person and their voice into the whole planning and decision-making of drug development. And that's how you build trust.
They build trust. It's all about the trust factor. And now we're kind of getting into the meat and potatoes of our discussion. We understand the importance. We understand how, why, the why. Let's talk about the real barriers to success, because that's what always surprises me. We assume that barriers are going to be certain things, and talking to you opened my eyes to realize the barriers sometimes don't even show up on the list of the sponsors. And unless you can address those barriers, it doesn't matter if you offer a copay card or if you offer a free transportation. If you don't address some of these other barriers, it's a no-show. So help us understand. That's really the meat and potatoes of. It's great to say I want to include diverse participants. It's great to go recruit them, but how do you get them to get in the study, and how do you get them to stay in the study by helping them overcome the barriers?
So, that's such a good question, because, people can list off the barriers and then they just stop, like, okay, now what do we do, right? So you go to a conference and you hear the barriers over and over, but, really, you don't walk into a community and start talking about clinical trials. Relationships are equal clinical trials. Trust equals clinical trials. And so that means that you build up relationships over time. And there are a couple ways to do it. So one of the ways that you do it is you build long-term relationships with minority-focused groups or advocacy groups, disease-based advocacy groups. And that's something that I've done over the last 25 plus years, starting in HIV, and still have those relationships. I think that you build trust and gravitas by being there even when you have nothing going on, right? So you're always checking in. You're always raising your hand when there's something going on, and you volunteer, or you touch base with people just to say hello. So you do that, and that's really important. The the same thing with the churches. You don't reach out to a church when you want to use them to advertise a clinical trial. You build those relationships and you continue with those relationships over time. The other thing that works really well is people like to be communicated with by others that look like them, that talk like them, and that have their disease. And so a model that works really well that I'm involved with right now is the Angels program at Tiger Lily. And that's hundreds and hundreds of women who have breast cancer. They're all Black, and they go into their communities and they teach other women about breast health. They may have already been diagnosed and they may not have been. Many women don't know that they need to do self-exams. They don't know how often they need to go to the doctor and get a mammogram. Maybe there are no doctors that they see on a regular basis. Maybe they only go to the emergency room because that's what they know. And then if they do get diagnosed, they might not know about biomarker testing and how to get treatment. So, more and more there are navigators out there in patient advocacy groups.
Mhm.
And again, if you build long-term relationships with people within advocacy, then you can partner with them and they're the trusted source. In the old days, I used to say trust bearers, that these people were trust bearers, but really they're friends.
Mhm.
They're friends who are trusted in the communities. And that's one way of breaking down the barriers, because you can't go in, get something, which is people for a clinical trial, and then leave and never come back. It doesn't work that way. I think, there's an organization for lung cancer that went in and built over 200 community centers of excellence around the country. That's another way of doing it. Going into community sites and saying, we want to teach you how to identify lung cancer in your community. We want to teach you how to do biomarker testing. And for those of you who want to do clinical trials, we're going to help you do that too, right? So that's another way, and it has been successfully done. And then the last thing that I'll share with you is social determinants of health are a big deal. And that is the constraints that you have when you live, work, play, and pray, as they say, in certain geographic and historically underserved areas. And it's not just that, it's that they're people who have often been marginalized, ignored. They don't have the same maybe political or strength that others have. And so we have to think about how we can help knock down some of those concerns that those neighborhoods have to make it easier for them to access healthcare. And it's a strong word, but I'm going to use it anyway. Those are areas that I think that are prevalent for health racism. And so what do we do about that? And I think that we're starting to see programs where we can help people get food, help people get other things paid for so that they don't have to choose between food and going to the doctor, paying their rent and getting medicine. But we've just touched, it's the tip of the iceberg. We're not there yet.
Mhm.
If we can knock down some of those so that people don't have to, say, is it this month or this month? I think that will really be the day where we can say, at least we're starting to get there and equal things out a little bit.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So DE&I just keeps going down a deep tunnel. The more I learn about it, the more I talk to you. And the common theme that I see over and over is to start early and address the real barriers, not the perceived barriers. Or in other words, the real barriers as the patient sees them, not as we as the providers see them.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right.
Common mistake we make, we just assume that these are barriers, but once you actually start talking to the patient, you find out that they're not even close to their barriers, that they're worried about eating tomorrow. They couldn't care less about making the doctor appointment.
It's very true. There's a physician I like very much who does clinical trials, and he'll visit his patients at home. And he told me the first thing he does when he enters the house is he walks over to the refrigerator and he opens it. And when he told me that, I was beside myself and not in shock. I was quite proud of him.
Mhm.
He wants to make determinations based on the needs of that family.
The real life needs of that family.
That's correct. And not everybody does clinical trial visits at home.
Yeah.
And not everybody stops and asks you what your needs are during a clinical trial visit. And maybe that's something that should be taken into consideration. It's certainly not, those aren't questions on the case report form, right? And so we're not capturing it. Today, transportation, pretty much is covered for people. The other thing that's covered oftentimes is a meal. But let's be honest. If you're not aware of clinical trials, and if they're not accessible, then it doesn't really matter whether you're given transportation and food. So for people in historically underserved areas who are never aware of trials, or they're not accessible to them because they don't have a regular doctor, or they don't get diagnosed till stage 3 for that reason, they may not qualify for a trial at the time that they're diagnosed, even if they were told about one. So I think that that's important to think about. I will tell you, I went on a study visit down south, and there were a group of women sitting outside waiting to be seen. And most of them, it was cold out, even though it was down south. And most of them weren't wearing appropriate clothing for the weather. And one or two of them had their feet sticking out through their shoes. And I sat down and talked to each of them individually, and I asked them about their shoes. And they told me that they couldn't get new shoes. One said, well, it's shoes or food. And another one said something about her children. And it's lasted, all of this time with me. And my dilemma was, do I offer to pay for shoes? Or do I give money? How do I handle this? And it shouldn't be, and I didn't want to embarrass them. And we shouldn't be putting people in a position where we embarrass them. We should be able to do things for people in a different way. And so I think we in the pharmaceutical clinical trials business have to find alternative ways to make it easier for people to choose to be in a clinical trial. So first, to be told about them. Second, to include them. And then third, to make sure that they can get there. And we have to, I guess the fourth thing that I have to say is, for a very long time, I've done this for a very long time, I've heard people in our industry say, well, we have to be careful who we enroll because a certain type of person isn't going to be compliant or is going to drop out. And that's simply not true. Clinical trials, they give people hope. They give people a care circle that they've never had before. And that includes people who are underserved. It gives them something they've never had wrapped around them. And so the only thing that will keep them from not coming would be the support that they need to get there. And if it's that they're working 2 jobs and they need some financial support because they have to cut down to 1 job, or they need food because they've, missed a couple of days of work because they've gone to the study, that needs to be assessed so that they don't have those roadblocks to get to the clinical trial. And I think that it's just looking at it, again, you said it, Dan, through the eyes of the patient. And maybe those are some of the questions that we need to think about when we're designing a trial and thinking about the questions that we ask. Because certainly we're expanding our eligibility criteria, but our eligibility criteria doesn't include food, gas, rent, electricity. And so where do we include that?
Yeah. This has been fascinating. I could talk to you about these issues all day long because it's an area that gets a lot of lip service. People hear the term, but they don't really understand what, and I fall into that category. I didn't really understand what it was until you started teaching me. And so thank you for being my mentor and teacher in this area. And thank you for helping me understand the opportunity it presents to us as in the health sciences community to get this right. And to really make a difference in people's lives, because it's about I think trickling down the culture. And I do think at clinical trials, if we can do it at the clinical trial, it'll trickle down to the rest of commercialization. And I thank you for your efforts, and I thank you for all you've taught me. And thanks for joining us today, and have a great day.
My pleasure. Thank you.